India and Myanmar share not just a physical boundary, but traditional ties going right into the history in the 17th or the 18th century at least. And of course, in modern day, in the 21st century, it has been a partnership that has forms the part of India's first Look East policy and then the Act East policy. That's the subject of Simply Nitin this week. I'm Nitin Gokhale. So it may just be a coincidence or even may not be. But each time in the past 3.5 years that India and China have had border tensions, there has been a high level visit exchanged between India and Myanmar. In 2017, when the Doklam or the Dolam crisis was at its peak, in July 2017, the chief of the Myanmarese army came to India for a 7-day visit. He was accorded a red carpet welcome. He went to Bodh Gaya, of course, which is a revered shrine for largely Buddhist population of Myanmar and also the Myanmarese army. Then he went to different defense manufacturing units in Maharashtra and in Gujarat. He was given meetings with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, and he was hosted by all the three chiefs of the Indian Armed Forces during his visit and stay in Delhi. And several other agreements, both declared and non-declared, were signed during his visit. India, of course, supplies a lot of hardware to the Myanmarese armed forces, including 105 mm artillery guns, torpedoes. There are night vision devices that have been given to them, wargaming software given to the Myanmarese armed forces, and of course, several additional slots have been provided to the Myanmarese armed forces officers in Indian training institutions, Indian military training institutions. They are provided language training to understand and speak and write English, for instance, is one of the major aspects of the defense cooperation. But the defense cooperation, of course, goes much beyond that. And earlier this week, for the first time, the Indian Foreign Secretary, Vardhan Shringla in this case, and the Indian Army Chief, General MM Naravane, traveled together to Myanmar to have very high-level meetings with Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the state councillor, then the president, of course, of Myanmar, and the army chief had separate meetings with the military leadership. It of course helps that Army Chief General Naravane was India's defense attaché in Myanmar between 2007 and 2009. So he has deep roots in the Myanmar defense establishment. Some of his friends from that time have risen like he has in the Indian Army. That time he was a colonel. And those who were almost equivalent to him or little senior to him are now the leaders in the Myanmar army. The personal bonding helps. And therefore, the outcome of this visit of both the Foreign Secretary and the Defense Secretary is important in many aspects. There are civil factors and there are military aspects to the visit and the outcomes that have been declared, and some of them not declared. For instance, I think the long pending operationalization of the Sitwe port in the Rakhine state will be operationalized in first quarter of 2021, in the next 6 months, is what the decision has been taken. Then the trilateral highway that connects India to Thailand via Myanmar, or even going beyond up to Singapore, has progressed far beyond the recent laggard kind of progress that was there. Then the Kaladan multimodal transit transport project has also progressed according to the press note of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. And of course, India has promised Myanmar the sharing of COVID vaccine whenever it's made available to India as on priority basis. So clearly, India is pulling out all stops to keep Myanmar happy and on its side, given the fact that the inroads by the Chinese in the Myanmar politics as well as in its infrastructure projects is huge. In fact, there are reports that one of the EEZs in Myanmar is now being taken over almost by the Chinese, and many Chinese companies are now establishing a foothold in Myanmar. This, of course, is a contest that has been ongoing since the early part of this century. In fact, if you recall, it was General VP Malik, the Kargil time Army Chief of Indian Army, who had actually re-energized and reconnected to the Myanmarese government, Myanmarese establishment, when he led a huge and a high-level delegation in early 2000 to Myanmar to revitalize the relationship, which was in a limbo for almost 5 years before his visit in 2000. That was because, of course, India was caught between its desire to be seen as a supporter of the pro-democracy movement and supporting the leader of the pro-democracy movement, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was given a peace prize, the Nehru Peace Prize by India, which angered and annoyed the military junta there, and therefore they cooled off from cooperating with India. But that visit by General Malik and the subsequent visit of the army leadership to Shillong really revitalized and re-energized the relationship. And since then, the defense cooperation has been the centerpiece of India-Myanmar cooperation. There are, of course, various civilian aspects to it, as I said. The Rakhine State Development Program, which India funds, then the Skills Training Center that India has established. Now, one of the outcomes of this visit is that India has offered to establish a oil refinery for Myanmar, and India has now promised that it will buy some pulses, moong dal or the urad dal rather, from Myanmar before 2021. So one interesting aspect is of a historic nature. Lokmanya Tilak, the famous freedom fighter who died in 1920, was imprisoned in the Mandalay prison during his time as freedom fighter in the early 20th century. And both the governments have now decided to commemorate his 100th death anniversary by installing a bust of Lokmanya Tilak, because he actually wrote a very famous book called Gita Rahasya, which explained the details and philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, and while he was imprisoned there. So that's a cultural aspect to this relationship. One aspect which normally gets covered very heavily in the Indian media is the defense and the security cooperation. And this has been an ongoing kind of relationship between the two defense forces and intelligence forces, that Indian insurgent groups operating in the northeast have traditionally taken shelter in the unguarded or unadministered areas of Myanmar, which border Indian states like Nagaland and Manipur. And most of the time, the Indian insurgents have crossed over, have established camps very close to the Indo-Myanmar border, so that they are away from the Indian security forces and there is nobody to disturb them there. But occasionally, and now recently very frequently, the Myanmarese army has been acting against these insurgent groups. Last year, 22 of these insurgent leaders, if not cadres, were arrested by the Myanmarese army and handed over to India. This is not the first time this has happened, but this is something that Myanmar was loath to declare it openly in the earlier times. This time in 2019, they declared it, and India, I think, thanked them during this visit of the two high officials earlier this week. Earlier, there have been instances where there have been joint operations by the two armies. For instance, way back in 1995, when Operation Golden Bird had taken place on the India-Myanmar border. Then there were other operations in between in 2000, then in 2003. And of course, occasionally the insurgent leaders keep getting arrested. One of the important insurgent leaders from the northeast, Paresh Barua of the United Liberation Front of Assam, still shuttles between a place called Taga in northwestern Myanmar and Ruili, which is northeastern Myanmar bordering China. So he travels to Yunnan province of China from Ruili time and again, is what one learns from various reports and intelligence inputs. India has been pressing for his arrest or action against him from Myanmar. That hasn't happened, but they have acted against groups like UNLF of Manipur, PREPAC, PLA of Manipur, not the Chinese army, but the PLA insurgent group of Manipur. And of course, there are ups and downs in that relationship or that kind of cooperation. Why insurgent leaders go there is because, as I mentioned, those areas are not very well administered or even secured by the Myanmarese government or the Myanmarese army. I had one such occasion in 2003 to visit then chairman of UNLF, who's called R.K. Meghen. His real name is R.K. Meghen, but is famously called Sanayama. At his invitation, I had traveled with other journalist colleagues to a hideout in Myanmar in the winter of 2003. In fact, in the month of November 2003, and spent 5-6 days going and coming to that camp to understand what did they want in terms of secessionism or separatism from India, and what was their end objective. It was an interesting visit, but of course, Sanayama has since been arrested. In fact, he served a term in the jail and is now out, of course, on bail. But UNLF continues to be active in Manipur, in the Imphal Valley, and other groups are either active or passive, depending on their leaders being either arrested or fleeing from the Indian security forces. So Myanmar and India share an interesting aspect on their border management too. The border is not fenced. There is a protocol between the two countries where citizens of both sides can visit or enter each other's territories up to 10 kilometers from the border without being stopped or without passport and visa. So that protocol still exists, and therefore it is difficult sometimes for security agencies to distinguish between terrorists, insurgents on one hand and common citizens on the other, because they can mix with each other. And yet the security cooperation now forms, as I mentioned, the defense and security cooperation is the centerpiece of India-Myanmar relationship. This, of course, is unsaid that all this comes at the backdrop of increasing inroads by China into Myanmar. But Myanmar also tries to balance its relationship between these two Asian giants, India and China. And therefore, it's an interesting power play that happens in Myanmar, which is an important aspect of India's Act East policy. It connects Southeast Asia. Myanmar connects India to Southeast Asia through the land border. And as I mentioned, the cultural ties go back a long way. There is a huge diaspora, of course, Indian diaspora in Myanmar, and you would be surprised. There are Indian Tamils who have been settled in Myanmar for a number of years, for almost 150 years now, and have become part of Myanmar society. There are Sikhs, there are Marwadis, and there are some Indian Muslims who are part of the greater Myanmarese society, have assimilated with them. And they still retain ties with their relations in India. May not be a very huge number of such people, but there are these ties there. And of course, there is the trade and commerce relationship between these groups of people, sometimes in Chennai, sometimes in Manipur, or even in places like Mumbai and Delhi. And the last point that I want to make is one of the common aspects or something that connects India and Myanmar is Buddhism. The majority population in Myanmar, as you know, are Buddhists, and for them, the most sacred place is Bodh Gaya. So there are direct flights between Mandalay or Yangon to Bodh Gaya, They are not very high frequency flights, or the number of flights are limited. But there is an attempt now to increase the frequency of those flights and create a Buddhist circuit for the Buddhist pilgrims coming from Myanmar into India. They want to go to other places like Sarnath and maybe a couple of other Buddhist sites. So that is something that is common and that cannot be shared between China and Myanmar. And this aspect India needs to build on if it needs to strengthen its already robust relationship with Myanmar. Hopefully, this aspect is being looked into, because my own personal experience of traveling to Myanmar tells me that wherever I went into shops or into markets or in public places, people would stop and ask, "Are you Indian? Are you Hindu or Muslim?" And when you say you are Indian, they would say, "You know Buddhism?" And they would say, "Have you been to Bodh Gaya?" Those kind of questions are asked even by common people. So I think India needs to build on that cultural connect India and Myanmar have, and therefore something that is unique to these two countries, which cannot be shared, as I said, between India and China. That's hopefully being taken note of. And this visit by the Indian Foreign Secretary and the Army Chief together. Incidentally, a lot of people think this is the first time the Indian Foreign Secretary and the Army Chief have traveled together publicly. Maybe publicly, yes. For the first time, it has been a declared kind of a visit. But there has been an occasion in early 2020 when General Naravane took over as the Army Chief, and the outgoing Foreign Secretary, Vijay Gokhale, traveled together to Bhutan to do some troubleshooting with the kingdom and the king in Bhutan because of the border issue with China, with of course has been an ongoing kind of a problem since 2017. So it's not the first time that the Foreign Secretary and the Army Chief have traveled together for some kind of building the bridges with a third country. But the fact is that this was a very public visit by these two high officials of the government of India. And clearly, the outcomes are something that both sides will cherish and build upon. That's all I wanted to flag, the connect between Northeast India, Burma or Myanmar and India, and of course, the greater strategic aspects of their relationship. I'll come back with more on more episodes of Simply Nitin in coming weeks. But until the next time, it's goodbye.